So yeah, although we talk about theophanies as being a small part of a religious tradition, in many ways they oftentimes represent the cornerstone of the tradition. That God spoke to Moses, which made the Mosaic tradition, which is really the Jewish tradition. Both Abraham and Moses are major authorities in the Jewish tradition, but oftentimes Moses is considered to be the father of Judaism. Or Jesus and the theophany of the voice that spoke to Jesus in the sky. That's also like a cornerstone of the faith of Christians, that Jesus was in fact, divinized, prophesized, validated by that voice in the sky. That Moses heard that Muhammad heard the Quran, and or that Joseph Smith discovered these golden tablets which had been left by some Jews who walked across the Bering Strait thousands of years ago and settled in Utah, and then the tablets that they left behind were discovered by Joseph Smith, and that became the cornerstone of the faith of the Mormons. They were a continuation of the Jewish/Christian tradition from thousands of years prior. So the Gita also has a theophany. And there's one verse I selected that I thought we would read together from that. And when the first nuclear bomb exploded, Oppenheimer, the German physicist who was in charge of the Manhattan Project, he actually quoted a verse from this chapter of the Gita. And if you listen to eyewitness accounts of people who were there, there's two versions of the verse he quoted. There's this verse is one of the verses given, and then there's another verse. It comes later in the same chapter. Now, Oppenheimer himself in the 60s mentioned the verse he quoted himself, which trumps the eyewitness accounts because it's him himself speaking about what he saw, and it's the other verse he quoted, not this one. But it's a really popular verse in the Gita. It's not one of the verses you memorize if you're learning the philosophy of the text, but it is a momentous occasion. And so I'll read the English to start, and then we'll go back through the Sanskrit and we'll look at it closely, and I'll make some further comments on it. If hundreds of thousands of suns were to rise at once into the sky, their radiance might resemble the effulgence of the Supreme Person in that universal form. Let's go through the language a little bit. Divi Surya Sahasrasya Bhavet Yugapad Utita. Surya Sahasrasya means of thousands of suns. Divi, in the sky. Bhavet, if they should. Yugapad, simultaneously Utita, arise. If thousands of suns were to arise simultaneously in the sky. Bha Sadrishi, effulgence like that. Sasyat, that this would be. That type of effulgence, it would be Bhashas Tasya Mahatmana, the effulgence of the great soul of Krishna. Mahatmana means great soul. We usually think of Mahatma in relationship to Gandhi. Gandhi actually his parents must have been perfume sellers, because Gandhi means a seller of perfumes. Gandha means perfume, and so Gandhi means one who has perfumes. And so it would mean that one of his forefathers was a perfumist. His full name was Mohandas Gandhi. There was a K in there too. I can't remember what it is. Karmachand. Yeah, so Karmachand. So moon of action. Mohandas Karmachand Gandhi. And so he's known by his surname, which is quite common. You're known by your surname. So like Agarwal in India means a grocer, someone who sells vegetables. Gandhi is a perfumist. And so you look at the surname of somebody. We have the same thing in English, blacksmith or shoemaker. You have different names sometimes, and those names meant in village life in the past, the forefather of that person performed that job, and so they became synonymous. It was Joe the blacksmith, and all his sons became, they took on the name blacksmith because they were part of a guild, and it was passed on from father to son. So he became Mahatma Gandhi, which means great soul, but that term is generally used for God. It's generally used for God. It occurs 3 times in the Gita. It is also used for devotees, great souls, but it's also oftentimes used for the deity. In this case, it's used for Krishna. And so Krishna has given Arjuna divine eyes, and his form became so big that the entire universe was contained within it. And that everything which had ever happened or would ever happen in all places and all times was visible within that form. And even death and life were visible within that form. So Arjuna was forced to contend with the idea that even life and death and suffering and pain are also part of what comes from the deity. And he had to reconcile that. A lot of times we contrast. We think that all things good and lovely come from Krishna. But then bad things, difficult things, we try to blame somebody else for them. And that gets problematic. If everything good comes from Krishna, but then bad things come from us, you run into a problem that some bad things are systemic, such as earthquakes and other natural disasters, or for that matter, congenital heart defects. It's one thing to blame you for violence that you committed towards me, or to blame the girl for the sand that she brought into the temple room and tracked into the temple room. That's easy to do because there was a direct cause. But when you have a child who's born, let's say, with a congenital heart defect and they die within a few months of birth, it's much more difficult to blame that child. And if you blame the parents for what happened to the child, then that starts to seem really unfair, that why would the child be punished for what the parents did? I mean, even in our legal system, centuries ago, we realized you can't punish a child for the crimes for the sins of their father. You used to be able to send a child to debt for the debts of their parents. All this stuff is long since been outlawed in most civilized places as being fundamentally immoral. So anyway, karma, the idea of karma extending past one lifetime, does circumvent this, because then the child who was born with a heart defect must have done something to warrant that in their previous life, and the natural disaster which was visited upon the community must have been deserved in some way. And it's a way of trying to escape from blaming God directly for things that happen in this world. But whether you do so through a dystheistic notion about God, namely that God's not all good, so God's angry and evil sometimes. Oftentimes the Christian deity is given as an example of a dystheistic deity, sending people to hell for thought crimes. Jealous and angry and violent and capable of really extreme punishments for sometimes really small crimes, such as thinking the wrong philosophy, and that winds you up in a lake of fire for all eternity. So one way around the problem of suffering or the problem of evil or the problem of pain is to envision that God's not necessarily all good, maybe all powerful but not all good. Another way around it is to envision that God's not all good, not all powerful, maybe all good but not all powerful. But then that becomes problematic because notions such as omnipotence and omnibenevolence are fairly important to a tradition. Because without God being all good, he's not worthy, she's not worthy of your worship. And without God being all powerful, there's no real value in being devoted to God, because there's greater, more divine things. This goes all the way back to Socrates and the Euthyphro dilemma, which I don't want to tangent too much, but at one point in the Socratic dialogues you get this question: does God love that which is good, or does it become good because God loves it? And so if God loves that which is good, then goodness exists above God, a priori, before God, and now God's not God, he's derivative, and goodness becomes God as something which exists beyond God. If something becomes good because God loves it, then that puts the proper order where you have a deity being the highest thing, but then goodness becomes arbitrary and it becomes whimsical, and God could just as easily have liked murder and rape and all sorts of evil things, and those things would become good, and that's also problematic. Usually the way to reconcile this dilemma, which is a pretty large philosophical dilemma that's been around for thousands of years, is to conceive of God as the greatest goodness personified. Now there's no need to look at God and goodness as being separate. God simply becomes the personification of all goodness, and therefore when you say that God loves that which is good, it means God loves that which is divine, like himself, like herself. And that was the resolution even from the time of the ancient Greeks, which is why they thought that logic and God were synonymous, which is why you get statements in the New Testament like, in the beginning was logos, and logos was theos. In the beginning was logic, and logic was God. Because when you found something logical or something good or something right, then it was understood you were coming closer to divinity. And then there was no artificial dichotomy between God and goodness that would have to be explained away by positing one above the other. Rather, God was the supreme goodness personified. I realize that was a slightly large paragraph of philosophy. It was sound, it made sense. If you guys didn't follow it, I'm not going to repeat it, but I was tracking myself while I was speaking, and it tracked. So you ultimately, on some level, somehow or other, have to reconcile the stuff in this world with the source. Otherwise, you've got a problem. Sometimes you posit the devil, which doesn't really get rid of the problem because God then created the devil, and so you're back to square one again. But you got to reconcile it, which is one of the reasons why ultimately Arjuna had to learn to see beauty in death, beauty in suffering, beauty in pain. And our version of that is it's fairly simple and isn't super exotic anymore. It was maybe 50 years ago. They did a poll in the 60s about ideas like karma and reincarnation, and they found out that less than 10% of the U.S. population believed in such things. They did a poll in the early 2010s. I don't know what you would call those, the teens. I know that we've named the 2000s as the aughts, but this happened like 2012, so I'm not sure what the nomenclature is for that. But I'm just, you could say the teens, right? The 10s, I guess you call it the 10s. The 1910s, that's what you would call it. So it'd be the 10s. But then I immediately think of 1910s because I was raised some time ago. And so when I say the 10s, it's hard to think that means the 2010s because it just happened 5 minutes ago. But anyway, irrespective of what term we use, in 2011, 2012, USA Today did a poll. And they found out that 60% of the U.S. population believed in things like karma and reincarnation. And they titled the article, "The Hinduization of We're All Becoming Hindus," was the title of the USA Today article. So the idea of karma and reincarnation and karma that goes beyond one lifetime, these ideas are they're quite typical. They're not avant-garde or unusual or super exotic anymore. You don't require some kind of tutorial. Even the idea of karma as a loan word into English, it's just pretty standard now. It doesn't require much explanation. In fact, other proper terms in English like theophany require a heck of a lot more explanation than a term like karma, although karma is a much more recent loan word into the English language, and theophany's been around for quite some time. I would guess, honestly, that 100 years ago, theophany was a much more commonplace term. People have lost their religious education and their philosophical education to a large extent, and so along with it, some of this language, which was understood by most people, now needs an explanation. But in any case, one of the major features of the theophany we're looking at now is that ultimately Arjuna will see everything that's ever happened, and he'll have to reconcile it with the existence of an all-good, all-powerful God, and it even includes death. I mean, Krishna is somewhat provocative and what do I want to say? Problematizing. Because the other verse, the verse that Oppenheimer quoted, Krishna says, "Time I am the great destroyer of the world, and I've come to destroy all of you." Kalosmi lokakshay krit pravridham. It's a very heavy verse, really forcing Arjuna to contend with the reality. I mean, earlier, theoretically, Krishna says, Mrityu sarva haraschaham, and I am death which takes everything away. We're not at that section of the Gita yet. We're at this beginning section where Arjuna is looking at the beatific, to use another kind of unusual term. If you're Catholic or you were raised with a Catholic education, I'm not Catholic, but I'm familiar with Catholic language from studying comparative religion. There's beatification, or the Beatitudes, which is from the Sermon on the Mount and the various blessings that God gave. And so there's this blessed vision, this divine vision of Krishna. You know this term?
I went to catechism in Spanish.
Beatificación. You don't know it? All right. Anyway, you get this amazing vision of Krishna where he has the effulgence of 1,000 suns rising simultaneously, but not blinding. And Arjuna was able to see Krishna clearly with the effulgence and wasn't merely blinded by the process. It's kind of a miracle that occurs in the Gita. And this happens in a religion. Miracles occur. And those miracles, for the faithful of that given tradition, are in many ways the formation of that tradition. This is the proof that Krishna is God. It's the proof that Moses was chosen. It's the proof that Joseph Smith was chosen. Now, for people who don't believe in this, then it's just a story in a book, and it's not worth the paper it was written on. But when you get these histories and you get these, versions of what transpired, just like, we have Greek history, like we're, Greek mythology. What's the earliest record of Greek mythology? You guys know? Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey. It's the earliest record. Novels written. But now obviously those ideas existed. He was making use of ideas which already existed, but when you look back in the record, that's the earliest literary record of all the deities. Interesting, isn't it? And so, you look at a tradition, and I think in a lot of ways, the most important thing to do when you're looking at a given tradition is to look at what it's trying to teach. I think believing in the miracle is a much less significant point, and it's actually a much later point that comes about as a consequence. As a consequence of what? Sure, that's pretty generic and pretty vague, but at least you're jumping in. As a consequence of what?
Understanding the point of what we are reading or learning.
Yeah. I think at least what intelligent people should do. Here's what I think intelligent people should do. Now, if you're raised in a tradition, you never question this, which is fine. You just grow up believing the stories that you heard from your parents. That's fine. Up until maybe your mid-teens, late teens. But at a certain point, when you're old enough to drink, or when you're old enough to sign up for the military and go off to war and risk your life, or when you're old enough to get married, so we'll set sort of like an upper limit of 18. I realize the age of drinking is 21. Now, I have not drunk alcohol since 1989. And so I've been sober as a judge. Don't even drink caffeine since 1989. So I got 33 years of full sobriety, not even caffeine. Don't even drink Coca-Cola for 33 years. Or tea, or green tea, nothing, zilch. But I still think it's a little strange that somebody can sign up for the military and go off to fight and risk their life and die and get married. Somehow or other they're not trusted to drink alcohol. I do think that's a little strange. Not that I think, I don't think anybody should drink. I'm not promoting alcohol in any way, shape, or form, but I do think to some extent our rules of engagement and like the rules of whatever it's called, the coming of age, what do you call it? The rules of, it's not discretion, the rules of, the age of consent. Bingo, that's it, the age of consent. I do think the age of consent is somewhat jumbled up in our country. I definitely think that you require a higher level of consent to risk your life and sign up years of your life and go off to some foreign land to fight in a battle. I think that should require a higher level of consent than drinking a wine cooler. Just my 2 cents. But at least by your late teens, the faith of your fathers and mothers, grandparents, needs to be replaced by you having examined your tradition dispassionately and having decided, is this what I believe? Sometimes people say, Jesus is God. If you don't accept Jesus, you'll go to hell. And my response to that varies. I give 2 responses, depending on the mood I'm in. Response number 1 is I was baptized in the Orthodox Church in late 1972, the year of my birth. So I can always just say, I was baptized in 72, I'm gold, I'm good. I accepted Jesus in my heart at that time, so whatever I do now doesn't matter. I'm gold, we're all good. That's one answer I sometimes give, because my upbringing allows me to do that as just a quick kill, just a quick conversation ender. And of course, then if the person wants to continue to correct me and tell me, no, it's not about just having been baptized, but it's about having a living faith, then that opens the door for me to question their faith as they're following their faith, which ends up that I feel really good about that conversation being very robust and me winning that conversation. So I feel like if they want to go that route with me and they want to say that to me, then that's a fun day for me, because now they've introduced the idea that it's not just about having accepted Jesus the way you said it, but you got to live it. And now we get to examine how they're living versus how I'm living, and that becomes a much more enjoyable conversation where I feel the ground has been equalized. The other answer I give is, obviously I don't accept the Bible, otherwise I'd be a Christian. So how would quoting the Bible to me get us anywhere? If Matt tells me, hey, give me your money, and I say, why? And he says, because I said so. Well, obviously him saying so wasn't enough to move the needle for me. Otherwise, when he said, give me your money, I would have taken out my wallet and given to him. So I'm clearly stating, by asking why, that him saying so is not enough by itself. You follow? So if it says, Jesus died for your sins, if you don't accept him to hell, and I go, why? And you go, because it says so in the Bible. Clearly, that's not going to move me, because I'm looking for a better reason than that. You guys follow this? I think to have a system where you have to have faith in the text as a starting point, a priori, as your beginning point, I think that's the beginning of all awful religion. I think it's acceptable for a child. Let's say, I don't know, below the age of 15 or something like that, depending on when you go through puberty, 15, 16, we'll even go 17. I think it's reasonable at that young age, where you haven't really thought about things deeply, for you to just copy what somebody else did, because that's how we learn how to speak, it's how we learn how to walk, it's how we learn how to do everything. And at some point, you take ownership of it, and it actually becomes yours. Just like we all have ownership of the English language, and we're not merely copying what our parents said anymore. But it's amazing to watch a child learn language. They just copy your words, and then kind of gradually they become theirs. And it, because of recursion in language, in the human language, they're able to then start creating sentences, because you can create an unlimited amount of sentences by referring back to the same language and putting it together, usually with conjunctions such as and or but, and you can have these complicated statements where you say, I went to the store. You can do it with all sorts of prepositional phrases. I went to the store with my friend on this day, at this time, to buy this thing for this purpose and paid this money. And we went in this car that broke down at this point, and we had to fix it by doing this. And then we got back on the road. You follow? And you can and you watch children learn how to do this, and they're taking ownership of the language. So at some point, and it happens a little later in life, in your teens, you have to take ownership of your belief system, your ethical system, your philosophy of life, your morals, your values, your raison d'etre, your reason for existence, your worldview. And so my other answer is why? And then when they say, because it says so in this book, I say, yeah, but obviously I don't accept that book, otherwise I'd already be a member of your tribe. You got to do better than that. So I think the best thing we can do when we look at a tradition is not get too wrapped up in these beautiful, poetic, theophanic verses, which are really designed for people who have already developed faith in the philosophy and the teachings of that tradition. Better, we leave all the miracles aside and we put them in a to be discussed at a later date category. Just kind of file them away in a section of your mind. Sounds kind of crazy, but cell phones sounded crazy in the 1600s. And so you just file that away in that section of your mind, to be looked at a later date. And then what you focus on is the teachings of that tradition. You look at the reasonableness and the coherence of those teachings, the coherentness of those teachings, and you kind of take a walk through the tradition and look at it with your critical thinking skills intact, and you ask yourself the big questions. Who am I? Why am I here? Is there a source of all existence? If there was a source, what would that source look like? And then you look at this version of divinity which is being offered up in the text, and you think, does this sound like a reasonable candidate? Does this correspond to the qualities I would expect to see in a valued or valid or reasonable or good or legitimate conception of divinity? And then what will happen sometimes, there's a lot of ways this could go. You could not ever find a tradition you like. You could come up to some answers that there is no deity. You're out on a limb. But if you do, and I honestly think the arrival at basic theism has to occur independent of a particular revelatory text. Your belief in divinity cannot be based on simply because it's said in a book. You have to have better reasons for that. Because then what happens when somebody goes, well, it says you should rape and kill and murder in my holy book. And so, I have just as much justification. If your whole thing is based on just your adherence to a book, and that's just your starting point, and you've got no good reasons for why you believe in your book, then I can just cite that my book tells me this, or I had this thought come into my head. Why do I even need a book? I wrote it down. Now it's in the book. I wrote it down yesterday. And that's a serious problem. And really, the field of religious discourse, or comparative religion, or polemics, or apologetics, or theology, these entire fields are designed so that just because you believe in God doesn't mean you throw out all reason and all intelligence and you can just say any damn nonsense and think you're good. You at least got to be able to sing through your supper and put together a coherent argument. So I think that these type of verses, this beautiful verse I love, Divi Surya Sahasrasya Bhaved Yuga Pad Utita, 1,000 suns rising in the sky at once. That would be Jodi. If that happened, Bhasadrishi Sasyat Bhasha Stasya Mahatmanaha. That would be like the effulgence of the Great One appearing before Arjuna, giving this theophany, giving this revelatory, miraculous appearance of God in this world that becomes the cornerstone of the community's faith. But it doesn't become the cornerstone of the community's faith in the beginning. Hey, open that door for me, would you? And you can see why our friend would have had just an absolute meltdown if I'd given this class. Just my opening gambit was enough to for the cracks to start to show. And so we wouldn't have gotten anywhere near this. So as unfortunate as it was, we had no choice but to welcome her to leave. Your starting point has to be, what do I believe in? What should I believe in? Who am I? Am I the body? Is consciousness just a material derivative phenomenon of electrochemical neural pathways in the brain? Or are there facets of consciousness that can't be explained by chemistry? Which is really what biology becomes. Biology becomes, at a high level, biology becomes chemistry. Chemistry becomes physics. Are there features of consciousness which go beyond the laws of chemistry? Are chemicals conscious? Is there something unique about the conscious experience? Is consciousness irreducible? If it is irreducible, is there a source of all consciousness? What would that source of all consciousness look like? It would have to be conscious if consciousness itself was irreducible. What would a source of all consciousness look like? Would it be all good? Would it be all powerful? Would the purpose of life then be to look for that supreme being? What would be a reasonable version of that supreme being? Having done this kind of homework, you're then in a good position to read a religious text, a revelatory text. And at least have the best shot at judging its legitimacy or reasonability or coherence. Just like if you want to read a Japanese book on poetry, there's a precursor that it has to occur before you can read a Japanese book on poetry. You know what it is? You gotta learn Japanese? That's step one. You follow? Then you're in a position to read a book on poetry and judge its values or faults. You shouldn't read that book on poetry and try and learn Japanese from it. You actually have to learn Japanese as a separate endeavor. And so there's a certain precursor that's required before you can really get into a revelatory text with its theophany, with its miracles being described. And that is, you have to know what good religion looks like. And that study actually takes place outside of the revelatory text and tests your critical thinking skills. And in many ways, that's the birthplace of faith. You can still get that from another person. You can sit with somebody and they can almost bequeath to you faith. Just like someone who knows Japanese can teach you Japanese independent of the book. They could just sit down with you, just like you can learn language from someone who speaks. Just like you learn how to speak from your parents. It can happen organically, but at the point where you're ready to make it your own, you have to now go through this process. So you have to do it from the very beginning, or you have to do it at some point in your mid-late teens. And at that point, you can actually read a revelatory text and appreciate it. And then what happens sometimes, and we'll finish with this, then what happens sometimes is you find a tradition, a revelatory text, a text which has been revealed, which has knowledge from above coming down. At least that's what they say. And you read it neutrally, with your full cognitive faculties turned on, having done the homework and understanding philosophy, good arguments, and good reasoning. Actually, there's a famous biblical scholar who, when he teaches the Bible to students at a graduate level, the first book he gives them is How to Read a Book, which is a secular book on how to read a book. Open that door for me. Because you have to know how to read a book in order to read a particular book. You got to be able to pick out themes and arguments and look at the evolution of ideas and so on and so forth. So, once you've done that work, once you put that time in, you can now neutrally read a quote-unquote revelatory text. And you can scrutinize it. And you can examine it. And you can make a judgment call. And what happens sometimes is you find a text. And because you've done that work ahead of time, the value of the text is actually highlighted and amplified. And you find a text which so confirms and validates and extends everything you've been thinking and learning and fighting to cognize and fathom. And the text almost effortlessly paces you and then goes so far beyond what you thought was possible in a way which is nonetheless congruent with what you've already figured out, that you think, oh my God, this is a revelation. This is my tribe. This is my text. These are my people. This is my tradition. And so the right to choose a tradition is secondary or tertiary. The order of events is that you have to grow up to a certain level. And I'm just going to make it to make it somewhat specific and not totally vague. I'm saying mid to late teens. And you got to start to ask the hard questions. The nature of consciousness, the nature of self, what exists? Who am I? Why am I here? What's the purpose of life? Is there a source? What's that source look like? You got to do some of that. Then you can read the poetic, revelatory sections of a text. And you can start by examining its philosophy. And the poetry becomes a secondary pursuit. And then once you've examined that philosophy, you can judge its legitimacy, persuasiveness, coherence, reasonableness. And then sometimes you might find a text which just paces everything you've learned and then skyrockets beyond what you ever would have thought of in a billion years. And at that point you can appreciate that. Then you found your tribe. You found your tradition. But at that point you can appreciate the poetry. It actually happens much later. And we have a piece of beautiful poetry here. Divi Surya Sahasrasya Bhavet. Divi Surya Sahasrasya Bhavet Yuga Padutita. Thousands of suns rising at once in the sky simultaneously. Jadi Bha Sasyat Bhashas Tasya Mahatmanaha. That was the effulgence that would be something like the effulgence of the Lord, of the Great One, of the Supreme Being, that Arjuna was seeing. And there's a reason why this doesn't happen at the beginning of the Gita, but that rather happens 2/3 of the way through the text, because you've had 2/3 of the text to learn theology and philosophy and examine it. And at that point, you're in a position to have a revelation, to have an experience of divinity, because you put in the precursor work. Now you could theoretically, just to troubleshoot this a little bit or problematize a little bit, you could theoretically, Ishwar Chandra here, could theoretically just all of a sudden, out of nowhere, have an experience of God from scratch. You got to wonder, why would he have an experience of God from scratch? An all-good and all-powerful deity, why would he arbitrarily choose one person to give an experience to over another? You got to start to wrestle with those questions. But let's say in his previous lifetime he did something, he couldn't remember it, and then in this lifetime it kicked off. We could argue. We could still make it consistent with a morally astute deity. But he never studied anything and didn't have an experience of God. So just like we have Karma Chand, is Gandhi's middle name, so his name is Ishwar Chand. Which means, you asked me what your name means. It means God moon. Ishwar comes from Ish, which means controller, and so Ishwar is a standard term for God in Sanskrit. Very similar to the English word Lord, which could sometimes be used for an individual, but is most of the time used for God as non-honorific. So Ishwar means the controller, and then Chandra means moon. So it's a compound, controller moon. And then compounds in Sanskrit, which are called samas, are broken down in different ways. You have the standard ones are Tatpurusha, Bahuvrihi, Dvandva, and then within the Tatpurusha category, Karma Dharaya. And these are kind of the standard compounds which would mostly refer to your name. And depending on how we broke your name up as a compound, like for instance, you could say red coat. The red coats are coming. So that doesn't mean actual red coats are like, floating through the air. It means British soldiers who traditionally wore red coats when they went to battle, they're coming. That would be an example of a Bahuvrihi Samas. That it's not, when you say red coat, you mean the person who's wearing the red coat. Then you have like Tatpurusha, like mountain peak. It's two nouns where one of them becomes attributive and modifies the second one. So mountain and peak are both nouns. But when you put mountain peak together, mountain becomes an adjective modifying the word peak. Anyway, there's different ways to break up your name. So we'll do it later. I'll go through your whole name for you. But just to, impress you guys with my knowledge of Sanskrit compounds. So Ishwar Chandra theoretically could have an experience of God without any previous training. Basically, in total contradiction to what I just suggested. And that could confirm his faith, because he actually saw divinity. Of course, if he wanted to convince any intelligent person of that, what would he have to do? He would have to codify his teachings into a reasonable philosophy, then teach that to people so that they would then have a good reason to believe in his revelatory experience. Otherwise, he'd just be making a bunch of fanatic followers who just took him at his word, and now you got the birthplace of all awful religion. And so even if one person did have an experience of divinity completely independent of the trajectory I just suggested, if he wants to attract anything but fanatic followers, and he wants to attract the minds of any intelligent person, he's then got to do what I just described, which is namely codify it into a reasonable system, give people access to that so they have a reason to believe in his poetic experience of divinity. Anyway, I thought of the verse when I sat down, and then but just because of the way my mind works, I thought about what would it really take for you guys to appreciate the verse the way I appreciate the verse, and I figured I would just chalk out for you guys the basic steps that would be required, and by understanding the steps required to appreciate this verse like I do, you now have the steps that are required to appreciate any verse in any revelatory text describing any theophany for all time, and you can just go ahead and sally forth into the world and ask yourself all those questions, and then look at the various offerings of different traditions and navigate them and appreciate them and critique them and compare them. We had our biggest festival of the year up in Los Angeles today at Venice Beach. 20,000 people came, including most of our community, so we're a tiny little group today. But you guys came. I also showed up so that we would at least have a program. We cooked for you guys. And, since early morning we've been doing that. It was a Rath Yatra, 40-foot high chariots with Jagannath, Baladev, and Subhadra walking down Main Street in Santa Monica down to Venice. We took over the boardwalk, which they allow us to do. We're the only festival that gets to take over the entire boardwalk one day a year. It's the day of least crime in Venice Beach. I heard that from a Venice Beach police officer 35 years ago at my first Rath Yatra. I asked him, and he told me, there's no crime on this day. It's amazing. We feed 20,000 people, a free vegan feast. We have really nice performances that take place. And so everybody's up there, but some of us rolled back quickly before the festival was totally complete so we could put this on. You guys showed up. We're really honored by your presence. We're going to do a little kirtan now, and then we'll have a nice vegan meal together. Thank you so much. Hare Krishna.